In the shadowed corridors of Valdoria's ancient palace, where whispers carry more weight than royal decrees, Crown Prince Alexander faced the most devastating choice of his life. The dying king's final command echoed in his mind like a death knell. "She must go, my son."
For the crown to survive, she cannot remain. The woman who had stood beside his father through scandal and triumph, who had helped rebuild the monarchy's tattered reputation, now found herself cast as the villain in a story she never wrote. Lady Catherine Moreau, the king's beloved companion, had become the sacrifice demanded by a kingdom on the edge of revolution. But some battles are fought not in the public eye, but in the private chambers where hearts break and loyalties shatter. As the palace gates prepared to close forever on the woman who had dared to love a king, 3 generations of royal blood would discover that the crown's greatest enemy might not be the angry crowds outside, but the secrets buried within their own walls. What happens when duty and love collide? When the price of saving a throne is destroying the very people who helped build it? In Valdoria, the answer would reshape a dynasty forever. The autumn rain hammered against the towering windows of Valdoria Palace like angry fists demanding entry. Inside the opulent chambers that had housed kings for 3 centuries, Crown Prince Alexander stood frozen before his father's deathbed, the weight of a dying monarch's final words crushing down upon his shoulders like a mountain of stone. King Edmund lay propped against silk pillows, his once commanding presence reduced to shallow breaths and whispered commands that would reshape the very foundation of their ancient kingdom. The cancer had stolen his strength, but not his resolve. His eyes, still sharp despite the pain medication coursing through his veins, fixed on his son with an intensity that made Alexander's blood run cold. "She has to go," the king repeated, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the full authority of centuries of royal bloodline. "Catherine cannot remain in the palace after I'm gone. The people will never accept her as queen mother. They see her as an outsider, a woman who stole their beloved queen's place." Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lady Catherine Moreau had entered their lives 7 years ago, when the kingdom was still reeling from Queen Isabella's tragic death in a car accident. The public had mourned their elegant, charitable queen for months, and when King Edmund finally emerged from his grief to find companionship with Catherine, a French diplomat's daughter, the reaction had been swift and merciless. The newspapers had torn her apart. They called her an opportunist, a gold digger, a woman who had seduced a grieving widower for her own gain. They ignored her charitable work, her quiet dignity, and the way she had slowly helped King Edmund find his smile again. They overlooked how she had modernized the palace's outdated protocols and brought fresh perspectives to royal duties that had grown stagnant. Most painfully, they refused to see how she had become not just a companion to the king, but a genuine friend to Alexander himself. Catherine had never tried to replace his mother, never overstepped her bounds, never demanded titles or recognition. She had simply existed in their lives like a gentle presence, offering counsel when asked and stepping back when needed. Now, as Alexander watched his father struggle with each breath, he felt the familiar burning sensation of anger rising in his chest. The same anger he had felt during every protest outside the palace gates, every harsh editorial in the morning papers, every whispered conversation among the staff that suddenly stopped when he entered a room. "Father, Catherine has done nothing wrong," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled despite the storm raging inside him. "She has supported this family, supported you, through your darkest moments. She helped stabilize the monarchy when the Republicans were calling for our abolition after Mother's death. She doesn't deserve to be cast out like some common criminal." King Edmund's eyes softened for a moment, and Alexander caught a glimpse of the man who had raised him, who had taught him to ride horses in the palace gardens, and had stayed up all night helping him prepare for his university entrance exams. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation of a ruler who had spent 40 years making impossible decisions for the good of his realm. "What she deserves and what the kingdom needs are 2 different things, my son." The king's voice grew stronger for a moment, drawing on reserves of energy that his failing body shouldn't have possessed. "The polls show that 60% of our citizens oppose her presence in the palace. The opposition party is using her as ammunition to call for a referendum on the monarchy itself. If she stays after I'm gone, they will have the public support they need to bring us down." Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked courtyard where protesters had gathered daily for the past month, their signs and chants demanding Catherine's removal from royal life. Security kept them at bay, but their voices still reached the palace walls, a constant reminder of the public's displeasure. "The kingdom has survived worse storms," Alexander said quietly. "We weathered the scandal of Uncle Richard's divorce, the financial crisis of the 90s, even Mother's death. It's about history. We can weather this too. Not this time." King Edmund struggled to sit up straighter, his royal bearing asserting itself even in his weakened state. "This is different, Alexander. The world has changed. Social media amplifies every criticism, every conspiracy theory, every cruel comment about Catherine's past. The Republicans have never been this organized, this funded, this close to achieving their goals. One wrong move after my death, and the monarchy ends with us." The weight of history pressed down on Alexander's shoulders. He thought of all the kings who had come before him, the portraits lining the palace halls, the centuries of tradition and duty that would fall to him to preserve. Yet he also thought of Catherine in her private sitting room, probably reading a book by the fireplace, unaware that the family she had come to love was preparing to abandon her. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it spoken aloud. King Edmund's voice became as cold and formal as a royal decree. "On the day of my funeral, you will inform Catherine that she is no longer welcome in the palace. You will provide her with a generous settlement, help her purchase a home in France where she can live comfortably, but she must go. The transition must be immediate and absolute. No gradual departure, no public farewell tour, no chance for the media to turn her into a sympathetic figure that the people might rally around. You want me to throw her out on the day we bury you?" Alexander's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Father, that's cruel beyond measure. She has been by your side for 7 years. She has given up her own life, her own dreams to support this family. And I have given her 7 years of luxury, protection, and purpose that she never would have had otherwise," the king replied, his tone growing sharper. "This is not about cruelty, Alexander. This is about survival. The crown has endured for 800 years because our ancestors made the hard choices, because they put duty before personal feelings. Now it's your turn." Alexander felt the familiar weight of royal duty settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. He had been raised from birth to understand that his personal desires would always come second to the needs of the kingdom. He had given up friends, romantic relationships, career aspirations, all in service to the crown. But this felt different. This felt like betrayal. "She loves you, father," Alexander said quietly. "Despite everything the press has said about her, despite all the speculation about her motives, she genuinely loves you. And you're asking me to repay that love by casting her aside like she never mattered." For a moment, King Edmund's composed facade cracked, and Alexander saw the pain in his father's eyes. Not just physical pain from the disease consuming him, but emotional anguish from the choice he was forcing upon them all. "Do you think this is easy for me?" the king whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "Do you think I want to die knowing that the woman I love will be alone? Catherine has brought joy back into my life when I thought I would never smile again. But love is a luxury that kings cannot always afford." The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment and the continued assault of rain against the windows. Alexander stared at his father, seeing not just the man who had raised him, but the institution he represented, the weight of history and expectation that had crushed personal happiness beneath royal duty for generations. "There has to be another way," Alexander said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. King Edmund closed his eyes, his strength finally beginning to fade. "I have spent months consulting with advisors, polling experts, constitutional scholars, even some of the moderate Republican leaders. They all say the same thing. If Catherine remains in the palace after my death, the monarchy will not survive your first year as king. The Republicans will have their referendum, and they will win." Alexander felt something cold and hard settling in his chest, the same feeling he imagined his ancestors had experienced when signing death warrants or declaring wars. The realization that being king meant making choices that would haunt him forever. "I need time to think,"
Alexander said finally. "Time is the one thing we don't have," his father replied. "The doctors say I have days, perhaps a week at most. You need to prepare yourself for what's coming. You need to prepare Catherine. I can't tell her while you're still alive. I won't do that to either of you." King Edmund nodded slowly. "Then you understand why this conversation had to happen now. After I'm gone, you'll be king. The decision will be yours to make. But know this, my son. If you choose differently than I have advised, you may be the last king our family ever produces." Alexander left his father's chambers feeling like a man walking to his own execution. The palace corridors that had been his childhood playground now felt like a prison, each step echoing with the weight of the impossible choice before him. Servants bowed as he passed, their faces carefully neutral, but he wondered how many of them already knew what was being planned. He found himself standing outside Catherine's private sitting room, listening to the soft sound of classical music playing within. Through the slightly open door, he could see her silhouette by the fireplace, her dark hair catching the golden light as she turned pages in what appeared to be a book of poetry. She looked peaceful, content, completely unaware that her world was about to shatter. For 7 years, Catherine had been a stabilizing presence in their chaotic lives. While the press painted her as an outsider seeking to profit from royal connection, Alexander had watched her quietly support his father through political crises, personal doubts, and the daily pressures of modern monarchy. She had never asked for public recognition or official titles. She had simply been there, reliable and genuine in a world where both qualities were increasingly rare. Alexander remembered the night his father had first brought Catherine to a family dinner. He had been skeptical, protective of his father's vulnerability, and suspicious of any woman who might be taking advantage of the king's grief. But Catherine had won him over, not through charm or manipulation, but through simple authenticity. She had asked thoughtful questions about his university studies, offered intelligent observations about current events, and most importantly, she had made his father laugh again. Over the years, their relationship had evolved into something resembling genuine friendship. Catherine had become someone Alexander could talk to about the pressures of royal life, someone who understood the isolation and scrutiny that came with their public positions. She had offered advice during his brief, ill-fated engagement to a duke's daughter, and had been one of the few people who supported his decision to end the relationship when he realized it was based more on political convenience than genuine affection. Now he was being asked to betray that trust, to destroy that friendship, to prioritize political survival over personal loyalty. The logical part of his mind understood his father's reasoning. Public opinion polls showed clear opposition to Catherine's continued presence in royal life. The Republican movement was indeed gaining strength, using Catherine as a symbol of everything they claimed was wrong with the monarchy: its disconnection from common people, its outdated traditions, its resistance to democratic accountability. But the human part of him rebelled against the cruelty of it. Catherine had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a grieving king and try to build a life within the suffocating constraints of royal protocol. She had endured years of public criticism with dignity, had contributed her time and energy to charitable causes, had been a faithful companion to his father through the loneliest period of the king's life. As Alexander stood in the hallway, torn between duty and conscience, he heard footsteps approaching. Catherine emerged from her sitting room, probably heading to the kitchen for her evening tea. When she saw him, her face brightened with the warm smile that had become such a familiar part of palace life. "Alexander, how is your father this evening?" she asked, her accent still carrying traces of her French origins despite years of living in Valdoria. "I looked in on him earlier, but he was sleeping." "He's resting," Alexander managed, the words feeling like stones in his throat. Catherine studied his face with the perceptiveness that had served her well in diplomatic circles before she met his father. "You look troubled. Is there something I should know about his condition?" Alexander felt the weight of the secret crushing down on him. Part of him wanted to warn her, to give her time to prepare for what was coming, but another part recognized that such a revelation would only cause unnecessary pain and might compromise his father's final days. "The doctors say it won't be long now," he said quietly, which was true enough without revealing the full scope of what lay ahead. Catherine nodded, her own composure wavering for just a moment. "I know. We both know. I hope he doesn't suffer." "He won't," Alexander assured her. "We'll make sure of that." They stood in the hallway for a moment,
Two people bound by their love for the dying king, unaware that those same bonds would soon be severed by political necessity. Catherine reached out and briefly touched Alexander's arm, a gesture of comfort that made his stomach clench with guilt. "We'll get through this together," she said softly. "Your father has been planning the transition of power for months. He has confidence in your ability to lead the kingdom into its next chapter." Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Catherine smiled once more and continued toward the kitchen, leaving him alone with the terrible knowledge of what that next chapter would really contain. That night, Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. He considered defying his father's wishes, keeping Catherine in the palace, and facing whatever political consequences resulted. But he also understood the cold mathematics of royal survival. If the monarchy fell, it wouldn't just affect the royal family. Thousands of people employed by the royal household would lose their jobs. Centuries of charitable foundations and cultural institutions would be disrupted, and the kingdom would face the uncertainty and expense of completely restructuring its government. As dawn approached, Alexander finally accepted what he had known since leaving his father's chambers. He would have to choose between his personal conscience and his royal duty. And like every king before him, he would have to learn to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his reign. The cathedral bells of Valdoria rang out across the capital city like a funeral dirge, their deep bronze voices announcing that King Edmund had drawn his final breath just as the sun touched the eastern horizon. Alexander knelt beside his father's bed, holding the king's still warm hand, feeling the awesome weight of the crown settling onto his shoulders with each tolling bell. Dr. Harrison closed his medical bag with practiced solemnity and nodded to Alexander. "His Majesty passed peacefully, Your Majesty. No pain at the end." The title still sounded strange to Alexander's ears. He was no longer Crown Prince, but King Alexander, ruler of 6 million subjects who would look to him for leadership through the turbulent years ahead. Within minutes, the palace transformed into a precisely choreographed dance of protocol and preparation. Private secretaries moved through corridors with hushed urgency, notifying government officials, foreign ambassadors, and members of the extended royal family. The palace's ancient machinery of state funeral planning, refined over centuries of royal deaths, ground into motion with mechanical efficiency. Alexander stood at the window of what had been his father's study and was now his own, watching as flags throughout the city were lowered to half-staff. Television trucks were already gathering outside the palace gates, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like electronic flowers seeking the sun. Soon the world would be watching Valdoria, analyzing every decision the new king made, measuring his worthiness to inherit the throne that had been his destiny since birth. But through all the activity and preparation, one thought dominated Alexander's mind with the persistence of a migraine. He had 3 days until the funeral, 3 days until he would have to fulfill his dying father's final command and destroy the life of the woman who had brought his father happiness in his final years. Catherine had been by the king's side when he died, holding his other hand while Alexander knelt opposite her. She had whispered words of love in French, her native language, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the man she loved slip away from the world. In that moment, Alexander had seen the genuine depth of her grief, the authentic pain of a woman losing not just a companion but the center of her entire existence. Now she was in her rooms making arrangements to attend the funeral, probably choosing the black dress she would wear to say goodbye to the love of her life. She had no idea that the funeral would also mark the end of her own life as she knew it. Alexander's private secretary, James Morrison, entered the study carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents requiring the new king's immediate attention. James had served the royal family for 15 years, and his usually composed demeanor seemed strained under the weight of managing a royal transition during a time of national mourning. "Your Majesty, my deepest condolences," James said, his voice carrying the formal tone appropriate for addressing the sovereign. "I have the proclamation documents for your review, along with the funeral arrangements and the schedule for your first official acts as king." Alexander took the papers but set them aside without reading them. "James, I need your honest assessment of something. What will happen if Lady Catherine remains in the palace after the funeral?" James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the political implications of the question. "Sir, that would be unprecedented. Traditionally, the monarch's consort either becomes queen consort
or withdraws from public life after the sovereign's death. Lady Catherine was never formally married to His late Majesty, which creates a complex situation.
I'm not asking about protocol, Alexander said sharply. I'm asking about political reality. What happens to the monarchy if she stays? James set down his own portfolio and looked directly at his new king, recognizing the seriousness of the question. Your Majesty, I must be frank. The Republican movement has been gaining momentum for months, using Lady Catherine as a symbol of everything they claim is wrong with the monarchy. If she remains in the palace, they will likely have enough public support to force a referendum on the monarchy's future within your first year of reign. And if such a referendum were held, based on current polling, it would be very close. Perhaps 55 to 45 in favor of retaining the monarchy, but well within the margin of error. Any significant scandal or crisis could tip those numbers against us. Alexander walked to the window again, watching protesters gather in the square beyond the palace gates. Even in mourning, they carried signs calling for Catherine's removal and questioning the monarchy's relevance in modern society. Their numbers had grown since news of the king's death broke, and television reporters were already interviewing Republican leaders about their plans for the new reign. What does Lady Catherine know about the situation? Alexander asked. I believe she understands that her position is uncertain, James replied carefully. She has not asked about her future arrangements, but she is an intelligent woman. She must realize that changes are inevitable. Alexander felt a stab of guilt at those words. Catherine's intelligence and political awareness, which had made her such a valuable advisor to his father, also meant she probably suspected what was coming. Yet she had said nothing, asked for nothing, demanded no guarantees about her future. She was facing the potential destruction of her life with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout years of public criticism. Sir, if I may, James continued, there is another consideration. Lady Catherine's departure from the palace must be handled delicately to avoid creating a martyrdom narrative that the Republicans could exploit. If she appears to be a victim of royal cruelty, public sympathy could shift in her favor. So you're suggesting we find a way to make her voluntary departure look like her own choice? That would be ideal, yes. Perhaps she could announce her intention to return to France to be near her family during this difficult time of mourning. A gracious withdrawal that honors the late king's memory while allowing the new reign to begin without controversy. Alexander knew James was right from a strategic standpoint, but the suggestion felt like adding insult to injury. Not only would they be forcing Catherine out, but they would also be asking her to participate in a public relations fiction that painted her exile as her own decision. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Catherine herself entered, dressed in the simple black suit she had worn during the king's final days. Her eyes were red from crying, but her composure was intact. She carried herself with the poise that had served her well in diplomatic circles before she met the king. Alexander, she said softly, I wanted to speak with you about the funeral arrangements. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I wanted to make sure my presence wouldn't create any additional complications for you. The irony of her concern for his welfare, even as he prepared to betray her trust, hit Alexander like a physical blow. Catherine, you have every right to attend the funeral. Father would have wanted you there. She nodded, but Alexander could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I also wanted to discuss what happens after. I know my situation here is complicated. I don't want to be a burden on your reign or create difficulties for the monarchy. This was the opening James had suggested, the chance for Catherine to graciously offer to leave on her own terms. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine love and concern she still held for their family even in her grief, Alexander couldn't bring himself to manipulate her into making the offer. Catherine, we don't need to discuss that now. Let's focus on honoring Father's memory first. She studied his face with the same perceptiveness that had made her such a valuable advisor to his father. Alexander, you're not telling me something. What is it? Before Alexander could respond, James cleared his throat. Your Majesty, perhaps Lady Catherine should be made aware of the current political climate. The Republican movement is using this transition period to advance their agenda, and they have focused considerable attention on the question of her continued residence in the palace. Catherine's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. I see. And what are they saying? That your presence represents everything wrong with the monarchy, James said bluntly. They're calling for immediate democratic reforms and using you as a symbol of royal excess and disconnection from the common people. Alexander wanted to throttle his secretary for his tactless delivery, but Catherine simply nodded as if she had expected this news.
I understand. And what do the polls say about public opinion? Currently, about 60% of citizens support your departure from royal life, James replied. Those numbers have been remarkably consistent over the past several months. Catherine sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs facing the king's desk. For a moment, the mask of diplomatic composure slipped, and Alexander saw the full weight of her situation settling on her shoulders. She had given up her own career, her own country, her own identity to support the man she loved. Now that man was gone, and she was facing the prospect of losing everything else as well. Catherine, Alexander said quietly, I want you to know that whatever happens, you will be taken care of. Father made provisions for your financial security, and we will ensure you have everything you need to build a new life wherever you choose to go. She looked up at him with eyes that held no accusation, only sadness. It's not about money, Alexander. You must know that. I never cared about the luxury or the status. I cared about your father, and about this family that welcomed me when I had nowhere else to belong. The words hit Alexander harder than any angry accusation could have. Catherine had never been the gold digger the press painted her as. She had genuinely loved his father, and had found a family among people who lived under constant scrutiny and pressure. Now that family was preparing to abandon her for political convenience. I know, Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Catherine stood and smoothed her skirt, reassembling her diplomatic composure like armor. Don't apologize for doing what you think is best for the kingdom. I understood the risks when I fell in love with a king. I knew this day might come. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to Alexander. Your father was proud of you, you know. He believed you would be a great king. Don't let difficult decisions like this one compromise that belief in yourself. After she left, Alexander sat alone in his father's chair, surrounded by the weight of royal history and the expectations of millions of subjects. The irony was not lost on him. To prove himself worthy of being king, he would have to become the kind of man who could destroy the life of someone who cared about his welfare. James resumed discussing the practical details of royal transition, but Alexander's attention kept drifting to the window, where protesters continued to gather in the square. Their signs and chants demanded Catherine's removal, but Alexander wondered how many of them truly understood what they were asking for. They saw her as a symbol, a representation of everything they disliked about monarchy. They didn't see the woman who had sat beside his father's deathbed, holding his hand and whispering words of love as he drew his final breath. That evening, Alexander walked through the palace corridors, noting how different everything felt now that he was king rather than crown prince. The same portraits of his ancestors lined the walls. The same crystal chandeliers cast the same warm light, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a prince preparing to inherit responsibility. He was a king who had already begun making decisions that would define his reign and determine the monarchy's survival. He found himself outside Catherine's sitting room again, listening to the same classical music that had been playing the night his father gave him his final command. But tonight, the music sounded melancholy, almost funeral-like in its slow, measured progression. He could hear Catherine moving around inside, probably packing her belongings even though no one had yet officially asked her to leave. Alexander raised his hand to knock, wanting to say something to comfort her, to apologize for what was coming, to somehow make this situation less painful for everyone involved. But what could he say? That he was sorry for choosing duty over loyalty? That he hoped she would understand? That he would miss having her as part of their family? In the end, he lowered his hand and walked away, leaving Catherine alone with her grief and her uncertain future. Some conversations were too difficult to have, some truths too painful to speak aloud. The new king was learning that leadership often meant carrying burdens in silence, making decisions that no one else could make, and living with consequences that would follow him for the rest of his reign. The funeral was still 2 days away, but Alexander already felt like he had begun burying more than just his father. He was also burying the man he had been before becoming king, the man who could afford to prioritize personal relationships over political survival. That man was gone forever, replaced by a sovereign who would have to learn to balance love and duty, loyalty and necessity, the human heart and the demands of the crown. As he lay in bed that night,
Alexander stared at the ceiling and tried to prepare himself for the moment when he would have to look Catherine in the eyes and tell her that she could no longer call the palace home. He tried to find words that would make the betrayal seem less cruel, explanations that would help her understand why the family she loved was casting her aside. But no such words existed, and Alexander finally fell asleep knowing that in 2 days he would have to break the heart of a woman who had never been anything but kind to him, all in the name of preserving a monarchy that might not deserve to be saved. The morning of King Edmund's funeral dawned gray and somber, with low clouds hanging over the capital like a shroud. Alexander stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting the military dress uniform that marked him as the new sovereign, feeling as though he were putting on the costume of a character he wasn't ready to play. The gold braiding and ceremonial medals felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by the knowledge of what he would have to do after his father was laid to rest. Outside his window, he could see the funeral procession, route lined with thousands of mourners and spectators. The cathedral where his father would receive his final blessing was visible in the distance, its ancient spires reaching toward the overcast sky. Television crews from around the world had established positions along the route, ready to broadcast the ceremony that would mark not just the end of one reign, but the beginning of another, fraught with uncertainty. Alexander's reflection stared back at him from the mirror, and he barely recognized the man looking back. And 3 days ago, he had been Crown Prince Alexander, heir to the throne, but still cushioned by his father's presence and wisdom. Today, he was King Alexander, alone at the apex of power, with no one above him to share the burden of impossible decisions. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Catherine entered without waiting for permission, as she had done countless times over the past 7 years. She wore an elegant black coat dress with a matching hat, her appearance perfectly appropriate for the solemn occasion. But Alexander could see the strain in her face, the careful composure that barely concealed her grief. "I wanted to say goodbye before the ceremony," she said quietly, "and to thank you for allowing me to attend. I know it would have meant everything to your father to have me there." Alexander turned from the mirror to face her, struck once again by her grace under pressure. Even knowing that her world was about to crumble, she was thinking of others, concerned about honoring his father's memory rather than defending her own position. "Catherine, of course you should be there. You are part of father's life, an important part. No political consideration should change that." She smiled sadly, and Alexander realized she understood more than she was letting on. Politics has a way of changing everything, doesn't it? Your father taught me that. He said that being royal meant accepting that personal feelings would always come second to the needs of the kingdom. The words hit Alexander like a slap, partly because they echoed his father's own justification for the command he had given, but mostly because they revealed how much Catherine had learned about the cruel realities of royal life. She wasn't naive about her situation. She was simply choosing to face it with dignity rather than bitterness. "Catherine, Please," she interrupted gently. "Today is about honoring your father's memory. Whatever comes next, we can deal with tomorrow. Today, I just want to say goodbye to the man I loved and wish you well as you begin your reign." She stepped forward and briefly embraced him, the kind of familial gesture that had become natural over the years, but now felt weighted with finality. Alexander hugged her back, knowing it might be the last moment of warmth between them, before duty forced him to become her adversary.
"I'm proud of the man you've become," Catherine whispered.
"Your father was, too. Whatever challenges you face as king, remember that you have the strength to handle them." After she left, Alexander sat heavily in the chair by his window, overwhelmed by the irony of her words. She was telling him he had the strength to handle whatever challenges lay ahead, not knowing that she herself was about to become the first and most painful of those challenges. The funeral ceremony proceeded with the precise choreography that centuries of royal tradition had perfected. Alexander walked behind his father's coffin through streets lined with mourning citizens, many of whom wiped tears from their eyes as the procession passed. Despite the political controversies of the late king's reign, the public outpouring of grief was genuine and overwhelming. In the cathedral, Alexander sat in the front pew designated for the immediate royal family, with Catherine beside him in the seat she had occupied at every important royal ceremony for the past 7 years. She held herself with perfect posture throughout the service, never breaking down despite the emotional weight of the eulogies and hymns that celebrated the life of the man she loved.
During the Archbishop's lengthy sermon about King Edmund's legacy, Alexander found himself studying the gathered congregation. Government ministers, foreign dignitaries, members of parliament, and representatives from every corner of Valdorian society filled the ancient cathedral. Many of them were undoubtedly wondering what changes the new reign would bring, what policies would shift, what traditions would be modified or abandoned. But Alexander's attention kept returning to Catherine, noting how she participated in every hymn, bowed her head during every prayer, and listened intently to every word about his father's accomplishments. She was saying goodbye not just to the man she loved, but to the life she had built around him. After today, she would wake up tomorrow with no clear purpose, no defined role, no place in the world that had become her home. The graveside service was smaller and more intimate, limited to family members and close friends of the late king. As the coffin was lowered into the royal cemetery plot beside Queen Isabella's grave, Alexander felt the final weight of kingship settling on his shoulders. His father was truly gone, leaving him alone to face the challenges ahead. Catherine stood beside the grave longer than anyone else, dropping a single white rose onto the coffin and whispering something in French that Alexander couldn't quite hear. When she finally turned away, her face was streaked with tears, but her composure remained intact. The return to the palace after the burial felt surreal. The formal mourning period was over, and now began the work of transitioning from one reign to another. Alexander knew that tomorrow the newspapers would analyze every aspect of his performance as the new king, measuring his worthiness against his father's legacy, and speculating about the direction of his reign. But tonight, he had one final obligation to fulfill, one last command from his father to execute. As the palace staff began clearing away the remnants of the funeral reception, Alexander made his way to Catherine's sitting room, steeling himself for the conversation that would define the beginning of his reign. She was already there, still dressed in her funeral attire, but sitting quietly by the fireplace where she had spent so many evenings reading and listening to music. She looked up when he entered, and Alexander could see in her eyes that she knew why he had come. "It's time, isn't it?" she said simply. Alexander closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her, the same chair he had occupied during countless evening conversations over the years. But tonight felt different, formal, final, weighted with the authority of his new position. "Catherine, we need to discuss your future here at the palace," he began, his voice carefully neutral despite the emotional turmoil beneath his words. She nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I understand. You need to ask me to leave." The directness of her response caught him off guard. He had prepared elaborate explanations, political justifications, appeals to her understanding of the monarchy's precarious position, but she had cut through all of that pretense to the heart of the matter. "It's not what I want," Alexander said quietly, "but it's what the kingdom requires. The Republican movement is stronger than it's ever been, and they're using your presence here as ammunition against the monarchy. If you stay, there will almost certainly be a referendum on our survival within the year." "And you believe such a referendum would fail?" "I don't know. The polling is close enough that any significant controversy could tip the balance against us. The risk is too great." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace where flames danced among the logs. When she spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. "Your father asked you to do this, didn't he? In his final days, he gave you this command." Alexander felt his carefully composed facade beginning to crack. "How did you know?" "Because I knew Edmund better than anyone. He loved me, genuinely loved me, but he loved the crown more, and he raised you to have the same priorities." She looked directly at Alexander, her eyes holding no anger or accusation. "It must be terrible for you, having to choose between personal loyalty and royal duty."
It is, Alexander admitted, abandoning any pretense of royal detachment.
"Catherine, you've been family to me. You helped my father through the darkest period of his life. You've supported this monarchy when others were calling for its abolition. Having to ask you to leave feels like the worst kind of betrayal. But you're going to do it anyway." "Yes, because if I don't, there may not be a monarchy left to preserve." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens, where she had spent countless hours walking and thinking during her years in royal life. "What are the terms of my departure?" Alexander felt a stab of pain at her businesslike tone, the way she had shifted into diplomatic mode to protect herself from the emotional weight of their conversation. You'll receive a substantial financial settlement that will ensure your comfort for life. We'll help you purchase a home in France or wherever you choose to live. Your departure will be announced as your own decision, a desire to return to your homeland to grieve privately and begin a new chapter of your life. A public relations fiction to avoid making the monarchy look cruel. Yes. Catherine turned back to face him, and Alexander was surprised to see a small, sad smile on her face. You know, there's a part of me that's almost relieved. I've lived for 7 years under constant scrutiny, knowing that every word I spoke and every action I took was being analyzed for signs that I was somehow unworthy of your father's love. It will be strange to live as a private citizen again, to make decisions without considering their impact on the monarchy's reputation. You could have had that life at any time, Alexander said. You chose to stay, chose to endure the criticism and pressure, because you loved father. I did love him, more than I thought possible to love another person. But I also came to love this strange, complicated family and the institution it represents. I believed in what we were doing together. The modernization efforts, the charitable initiatives, the attempt to make the monarchy relevant to contemporary life. She moved away from the window and sat back down, her decision apparently made. When do you need me to leave? The announcement will be made tomorrow. Your actual departure should probably happen within the week, to avoid prolonging the media attention. And where will I go? That's entirely your choice. As I said, you'll have the financial resources to live comfortably wherever you prefer. Catherine nodded slowly, already beginning to plan for a future she had probably hoped would never arrive. I think I'd like to return to France initially. I have family there, friends from before I met your father. Perhaps I can rebuild some of the connections I let fade when I became part of royal life. Alexander felt a crushing weight of guilt at her words. She had sacrificed her own relationships and connections for the sake of their family, and now she would have to try to rebuild a life that had been interrupted 7 years ago when she fell in love with a king. Catherine, I want you to know that this decision doesn't reflect your worth or your contributions to this family. You've been nothing but loyal and supportive. If the political situation were different, but it's not different, she interrupted gently. And we both have to live with the world as it is, not as we wish it could be. You're doing what you believe is best for the kingdom, just as your father taught you to do. I can't fault you for that, even if it means the end of everything I've built here. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 7 years of shared history settling between them. Alexander tried to find words that would somehow make this betrayal less painful, some way to express his gratitude for her sacrifice, without making it sound like a platitude. I'll miss you, he said finally, the simplest and most honest thing he could offer. I'll miss this life, Catherine replied. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. I came here as a young woman who thought she understood love and duty. I'm leaving as someone who understands the price of both. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Alexander, promise me something. Don't let this decision define your reign. You're going to be a good king, but only if you don't let guilt about necessary choices consume you. Your father learned to live with difficult decisions. You'll have to do the same. After she left, Alexander remained in his chair by the fireplace, staring into flames that seemed to mock him with their cheerful warmth. He had just completed his first major act as king, and it felt like he had torn something vital out of his own chest. Tomorrow, the newspapers would praise his decisive action in resolving the Catherine question, and the Republican movement would lose one of their most effective symbols of royal excess. But tonight, Alexander understood more clearly than ever before what his father had meant about the crown being both a privilege and a burden. Every decision he made would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal feelings. Every choice would be measured against the survival and success of an institution that had endured for centuries and employed thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on royal stability. He thought about Catherine packing her belongings in rooms that had been her home for 7 years, preparing to leave behind everything familiar, to start over in a world that had moved on without her. He wondered if she would ever find love again, or if the pain of this abandonment would make her too cautious to trust her heart to another person. Most of all, he wondered if he had just saved the monarchy or simply postponed its eventual collapse by making the same kinds of cruel calculations that had characterized royal decision-making for generations. Perhaps the Republicans were right to question an institution that required such personal sacrifices in the name of political survival. But those were questions for another day. Tonight, Alexander sat alone in the palace that was now his home and his prison, carrying the weight of a crown that felt heavier than gold, and wondering whether the price of being king would always involve destroying the lives of people he cared about. 6 months had passed since Catherine's quiet departure from Valdoria Palace, and King Alexander stood once again at the window of his study, watching protesters gather in the square below. But this time, the crowd was different. Instead of demanding Catherine's removal, they carried signs reading, "Bring back Lady Catherine, and the king's cruelty must end." The irony was not lost on him. In trying to save the monarchy by exiling Catherine, he had created exactly the kind of sympathetic martyr narrative his advisors had warned him to avoid. The morning newspapers lay scattered across his desk, their headlines telling a story that had dominated the news cycle for weeks. Former royal companion living in humble French cottage. Read 1. Catherine's dignified silence contrasts with palace luxury, proclaimed another. The most damaging was a photo essay showing Catherine tending a small garden outside a modest house in Provence, looking peaceful but noticeably thinner than she had during her palace years. James Morrison entered the study carrying a fresh stack of polling data and press summaries, his usual efficiency undermined by obvious exhaustion. The past months had been a public relations nightmare, and Alexander could see the strain in his secretary's face. "Your Majesty, the latest polling numbers," James said, setting down the reports with the air of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Support for the monarchy has dropped to 48%, down 6 points since Lady Catherine's departure. More troubling, 73% of respondents now view her treatment as unfair or cruel." Alexander took the reports but didn't look at them immediately. He had watched the numbers declining week by week as the full story of Catherine's exile became public knowledge. Somehow, despite their careful management of the announcement, the truth had emerged. Everyone now knew that she hadn't chosen to leave. She had been forced out by a new king who prioritized political calculations over human decency. "What are the Republican leaders saying?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They're calling for immediate referendums in all the major cities," James replied. "They claim that Catherine's treatment proves the monarchy is fundamentally incompatible with modern democratic values. They're using her as evidence that royal power corrupts even well-intentioned rulers." Alexander walked to his desk and picked up one of the newspapers, studying a photograph of Catherine taken by a telephoto lens as she walked to the local market in her French village. She looked older, more weathered than she had in the palace, but there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen during her final years in Valdoria. A kind of peace, as if she had finally escaped from the pressure cooker of royal life. "Have there been any communications from Lady Catherine herself?" Alexander asked, though he had been asking the same question every week for months. "No, Your Majesty. She has maintained complete silence regarding her departure and her current situation. She has refused all interview requests from major news outlets and declined to make any public statements about the monarchy." That silence had become one of the most powerful weapons against Alexander's reputation. Catherine's refusal to criticize the royal family or seek public sympathy had somehow made her appear more noble than any angry denunciation could have achieved. Her dignity in exile stood in stark contrast to the palace's political maneuvering, making Alexander look petty and calculating by comparison. The study door opened without a knock, and Alexander's younger sister, Princess Victoria, entered with the kind of purposeful stride that usually meant trouble. Victoria had never supported the decision to exile Catherine, and she had been vocal about her disapproval despite the political risks of disagreeing with the new king. "Alexander, we need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been intimidated by royal protocol. "This situation with Catherine is destroying everything Father built, and it's destroying you along with it." "Victoria, we've discussed this." "No, you've dismissed my concerns, but you haven't discussed anything," she interrupted, taking a seat across from his desk without being invited. "The polling numbers are catastrophic, the press coverage is brutal, and worst of all, you look miserable every day." This decision is eating you alive, and it's time to admit it was wrong. Alexander felt a flash of anger at his sister's directness, but it was overwhelmed by exhaustion. Victoria was right about at least one thing: he did feel miserable. Every morning brought fresh evidence that his attempt to save the monarchy had backfired spectacularly, and every evening brought haunting thoughts about Catherine's loneliness in her French exile. "What do you suggest I do?" Alexander asked wearily. "Admit that I made a mistake? Undermine my own authority as king? Prove that I'm weak and indecisive?" "I suggest you prove that you're human," Victoria replied sharply. "That you're capable of recognizing when duty has led you astray and correcting course before it's too late. The people don't want a king who's so focused on political survival that he destroys innocent lives. They want a leader who can balance power with compassion." James cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing a family argument that touched on matters of state policy. "Perhaps I should leave your majesty to discuss this privately with Her Royal Highness." "No, stay," Alexander said. "Victoria, what specifically are you proposing?" "That I simply invite Catherine back to the palace and pretend nothing happened? Why not?" Victoria shot back. "Stranger things have happened in royal history. King Edward abdicated for love. Then years later, his brother George offered him a path back into royal life. Queen Elizabeth allowed divorced people to remarry in the Church of England after decades of opposition. Monarchies survive by adapting, not by rigidly adhering to decisions that prove to be wrong." Alexander considered his sister's words while staring at the photograph of Catherine in her garden. She looked genuinely content, perhaps happier than she had been during her final years in the palace, when the pressure of public criticism had been mounting daily. Would inviting her back be a kindness or another form of cruelty? "James, have we had any intelligence about Catherine's actual feelings regarding her current situation?" Alexander asked. "Is she genuinely content in France, or is this some kind of performance for the press?" "From what our embassy contacts report, she appears to be adjusting well," James replied carefully. "She has enrolled in art classes at the local university, volunteers at a literacy program for immigrant children, and has reconnected with some of her old friends from before she met His late Majesty. She seems to be building a genuine life there." "So bringing her back might actually disrupt her newfound happiness," Alexander mused. "We could be forcing her to choose between her personal peace and helping to repair the monarchy's reputation." Victoria leaned forward in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "Alexander, you're overthinking this. Why don't you simply ask her? Write her a letter, make a phone call, send an emissary. Find out what she actually wants instead of making assumptions about her feelings." The suggestion was so simple that Alexander wondered why it hadn't occurred to him before. For months, he had been analyzing polling data and press coverage, consulting with advisors and political experts, but he had never once attempted to communicate directly with the woman at the center of the entire controversy. "And what if she refuses to return?" Alexander asked. "What if she's happier without us and doesn't want to be dragged back into royal life? Then we'll have publicly admitted our mistake without gaining anything in return." "Then at least you'll know you offered," Victoria replied. "And sometimes the gesture itself matters more than the outcome. People will respect you for trying to right a wrong, even if it doesn't work out perfectly." That afternoon, Alexander found himself alone in his study, staring at a blank piece of paper, and trying to find words for a letter he wasn't sure he should write. How do you apologize for destroying someone's life in the name of political necessity? How do you ask for forgiveness from someone you betrayed for the supposed greater good? After several false starts, he began writing. "Dear Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well and at peace in your new life in France. I have been following the reports of your activities there, and I am glad to hear that you have found ways to contribute to your community and pursue interests that bring you fulfillment. I am writing to you today not as a king, but as someone who owes you a profound apology. The decision to ask you to leave the palace after Father's death was the most difficult choice I have ever made, and with the perspective of 6 months, I believe it was also the wrong choice. I convinced myself that I was protecting the monarchy and serving the greater good, but I now realize that I was simply taking the cowardly path. Instead of defending someone who had shown nothing but loyalty to our family, I sacrificed your happiness to appease political pressures that might have been overcome through courage and conviction. I know that an apology cannot undo the pain and disruption my decision caused in your life. I know that asking you to consider returning to royal life might seem like another form of manipulation, another attempt to use your kindness for political gain. But I am asking anyway, because I believe the monarchy needs your wisdom and grace, and because I have come to understand that institutions are only as strong as the values they embody. If you chose to return, it would be as a full member of the royal family, with all the respect and security that status entails. You would have my protection against any criticism or interference, and my commitment that you would never again be sacrificed for political convenience. But more than that, you would have my genuine gratitude and the knowledge that your presence makes us better than we are without you. I understand if you prefer your current life to the pressures and complications of royal duty. I understand if you cannot forgive what I did to you. But I had to ask, because some mistakes deserve the attempt to make amends, regardless of whether that attempt succeeds. With deepest respect and regret, Alexander. He sealed the letter and gave it to James with instructions to deliver it through diplomatic channels within 24 hours. Then he waited, knowing that Catherine's response would either begin the redemption of his reign or confirm that some betrayals cannot be forgiven. 3 weeks later, Alexander was reviewing budget documents in his study when James entered carrying an envelope with French postmarks. Alexander's heart began racing as he recognized Catherine's elegant handwriting on the address. Inside was a single page, written in the same careful script. Dear Alexander, thank you for your letter and for your apology. It took considerable courage to admit error, and I respect you for making that acknowledgement. You are right that your decision to exile me was wrong, but you are also wrong about your motivations. I don't believe you acted from cowardice. I believe you acted from fear. Fear of failing as a king, fear of disappointing your father's memory, fear of being the monarch who lost the crown. Those fears were understandable even if they led to hurtful actions. I have given considerable thought to your invitation to return to royal life. My months in France have been peaceful and fulfilling in ways I had forgotten were possible. I have remembered what it feels like to live without constant scrutiny, to form friendships based on genuine affection rather than political calculation, to make choices without considering their impact on public opinion. But I have also missed the sense of purpose that came with royal duty, the opportunity to support causes I care about. And yes, the family that welcomed me during some of the happiest years of my life. I will return to Valdoria, not because I forgive what was done to me, but because I believe the monarchy can be better than it has been. I will return with conditions that protect my independence and dignity, and with the understanding that this is my choice, made freely and without coercion. I hope that together we can show the kingdom that institutions can acknowledge their mistakes and emerge stronger from that acknowledgement. See you soon, Catherine. Alexander read the letter 3 times before the reality settled in. Catherine was coming back. She was giving him a chance to right his wrong, to prove that he could be the kind of king who prioritized human decency over political expedience. The announcement of Catherine's return was met with jubilation from her supporters and grudging respect from some of her former critics. The polling numbers began to recover almost immediately, and editorial writers who had condemned Alexander's cruelty now praised his willingness to admit error and make amends. But for Alexander, the real vindication came a month later, when he watched Catherine walking through the palace gardens again, stopping to examine flowers and chat with gardeners, looking like she belonged in a way that had nothing to do with titles or protocol. She had returned not as a defeated exile seeking royal protection, but as a person choosing to contribute her talents to something she believed in. That evening, Alexander found Catherine in her old sitting room, reading by the fireplace, as if the 6 months of separation had been a brief intermission rather than a traumatic exile. "Thank you," he said simply, taking the chair across from her that had been the scene of their painful goodbye. "Don't thank me yet," Catherine replied with a slight smile. "I'm back because I believe we can do better. Now we have to prove it." Alexander nodded, understanding that Catherine's return was not an ending but a beginning. He had learned that being a good king meant more than just preserving the crown. It meant embodying the values that made the crown worth preserving. And sometimes it meant having the courage to admit when duty had led him astray from those values. Outside the palace windows, the protesters had long since gone home, replaced by tourists and citizens who seemed genuinely hopeful about their monarchy's future. The polls showed increasing support for the royal family, but more importantly, they showed growing belief that their institutions could adapt and improve when they made mistakes. Alexander had begun his reign by breaking someone's heart in the name of political survival, but he would define that reign by proving that power could be wielded with both strength and compassion, that tradition could coexist with moral courage, and that sometimes the greatest act of leadership was admitting you had been wrong.